In November 2025, across the United States, 3 men faced the ultimate price for crimes that left communities reeling. One met death by lethal injection, another by a firing squad, and the third took his last breath behind cold prison walls. These were not random acts. These were the final chapters in lives defined by unspeakable horror, violence, and choices that shattered families and haunted neighborhoods. One abducted a 6-year-old girl from the safety of her bedroom in the dead of night, ending her life in the most unimaginable way. Another unleashed a spree of terror across a quiet town, leaving multiple victims in his wake and scrawling messages in blood that chilled investigators to the bone. The third's crimes spanned decades, a twisted path of betrayal, violence, and consequences that could not be escaped. Each case carried its own unique darkness, yet all converged on the same point: death row. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on decades-long investigations, courtroom battles, and the shocking truths behind these executions. We confront the reality of justice and the moral dilemmas it forces us to face. Now, to understand the full, chilling details of these cases, let's go back to where it all began. But first, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next jaw-dropping episode. Case 1: Bryan Frederick Jennings, Florida. Bryan Frederick Jennings was born on March 15, 1959 in Florida. A young man with no significant criminal record, he joined the U.S. Marine Corps seeking purpose and direction. By 1979 he was temporarily away from the structured life of the military, a young adult with impulses and decisions that would soon turn violent. He appeared ordinary to those around him, but his choices that night would reveal a darkness that no one could have anticipated. He was not motivated by financial gain or revenge. His crime was impulsive, predatory, and devastating. On the night of May 11, 1979, Jennings approached the home of 6-year-old Rebecca Cunash. Silently, he removed the screen from her bedroom window, slipping into the room without waking her parents. In the stillness, he abducted the child, placing her into his car and driving to a secluded canal nearby. There, Jennings committed acts of horrific violence. He sexually assaulted Rebecca, inflicted severe physical trauma, fracturing her skull and leaving visible wounds on her body, and then held her underwater until she drowned. The crime was merciless, calculated, and left an indelible scar on the community. The investigation into Rebecca's murder was painstaking and meticulous, relying on every small detail to piece together what happened. The first clues came from the scene itself. The window screen had been removed, footprints were found in the soft earth below the window, and subtle signs of forced entry indicated the perpetrator's path. Investigators measured the footprints carefully, noting size, tread patterns, and depth, which would later become crucial evidence in linking Jennings to the crime. The windowsill where the screen had been removed revealed fingerprints. Each ridge and loop told a story: the hands of the man who had entered that room, terrorizing an innocent child. The search for the suspect extended beyond the immediate scene. Police canvassed the neighborhood, interviewing residents and compiling reports of suspicious activity. Witnesses described a car in the area, unusual noises at night, and a figure moving near the canal the following morning. Each piece of testimony helped narrow the field of potential suspects. Jennings' own behavior soon drew attention. He was spotted returning home that night with wet clothes and damp hair, inconsistent with his stated whereabouts. When questioned, his responses were evasive and contradictory, raising red flags among investigators. Investigators meticulously compared the forensic evidence, footprints, fingerprints, and clothing traces, against potential suspects in the area. Jennings' military service records provided additional information: height, weight, and shoe size, all of which aligned with evidence from the scene. Detectives pursued a rigorous reconstruction of the crime. They mapped every step, from the abduction at the bedroom window, the route to the canal, and the final moments of violence. They recreated the timeline to determine when Jennings could have committed the act, cross-referencing with eyewitness accounts and his own statements. The investigation also included detailed interviews with family members, friends, and acquaintances, looking for any history of predatory behavior. Police learned of minor prior incidents of reckless or aggressive behavior that, while not criminal on their own, painted a picture of a young man capable of violence under the right circumstances. Finally, the accumulation of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and behavioral profiling led investigators to Jennings. Under questioning, confronted with the mounting evidence, fingerprints, footprints, wet clothing, and inconsistencies in his story, Jennings eventually confessed, providing chilling details that matched the physical evidence exactly. Jennings' first trial began in 1980, presenting a case that combined physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and his confession. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, and burglary, and he was sentenced to death. Over the next several years, procedural errors and appeals led to retrials. His defense argued technicalities and questioned the methods of evidence collection, but the courts consistently upheld the convictions. By 1986, after a third trial, the death sentence was firmly reinstated. Even then, Jennings spent decades filing appeals, petitions, and legal motions, delaying the execution but also allowing time for the case to be fully scrutinized by the legal system. Each appeal highlighted questions of procedure, mental state, and the ethics of long-term death row confinement. Nearly 46 years after the horrific crime that had shocked a nation, Bryan Frederick Jennings faced his final moments on November 13, 2025, at Florida State Prison near Stark, the same facility where some of the state's most notorious death row inmates had spent their final days. At 66 years old, he had spent decades confined in a small, sterile cell on death row, his life reduced to measured routines, legal appeals, and the slow passage of time. On the day of his execution, Jennings was offered a last meal, a final indulgence before the ultimate penalty. He chose a single cheeseburger, a portion of golden fries, and a cold soda, consumed quietly in his cell, the simple meal contrasting starkly with the monstrous act he had committed nearly half a century earlier. Later, he was escorted to the execution chamber, surrounded by guards and the silent hum of the prison's security systems. The air was thick with anticipation and tension. As the execution began, Jennings declined to give a final statement, choosing silence in the face of the long-delayed reckoning of his actions. He was administered the 3-drug lethal injection, a procedure carried out with clinical precision. The room was still, except for the subtle, tense sounds of monitors and medical equipment. Witnesses later reported the moment as chillingly serene. His chest rose and fell, arms twitched, and within minutes, life left his body. A final pronouncement of death echoed through the chamber, marking the end of a life defined by a single night of unimaginable violence. The execution was Florida's 16th of 2025, setting a new single-year record in the state's modern death penalty history. For decades, this case had loomed over the state's justice system, through retrials, appeals, and legal wrangling. And on that day, it finally concluded, a grim closure to one of Florida's most infamous and chilling cases, leaving a complex legacy of horror, justice, and reflection. Case 2, Stephen Corey Bryant, South Carolina. Stephen Corey Bryant was born on April 12, 1981, in Sumter, South Carolina, into a childhood overshadowed by trauma, abuse, and neglect. His early years were marked by physical punishment, emotional cruelty, and exposure to substance abuse within the household. These formative experiences left deep psychological scars, affecting his ability to form trust, process emotions, and understand consequences. Bryant's defense later argued that prenatal exposure to drugs and alcohol caused lasting brain damage, contributing to his impaired impulse control and decision-making. As a teenager and young adult, he struggled with substance abuse, erratic behavior, and brushes with the law, all while grappling with the lingering effects of abuse and emotional trauma. Friends and acquaintances described him as volatile, withdrawn, and unpredictable, a man quietly spiraling toward darkness. Between October 9 and October 13, 2004, Bryant unleashed a reign of terror across Sumter County, escalating from burglary and assault to cold-blooded murder. First murder, Clifton Dale Gainey. Bryant began with Clifton Gainey, a 36-year-old acquaintance. He shot Gainey, abandoned the body on a rural road, burglarized his trailer, and then set the trailer on fire. The arson was both a cover-up and a deliberate act of intimidation toward the surrounding community. Second murder, Willard T.J. Tejan Jr. 2 days later, Bryant targeted Tejan, a retired Air Force veteran. Gaining entry under the guise of needing help, he executed Tejan in a brutal and methodical attack, shooting him multiple times, torturing him with fire and cigarettes, and desecrating the scene with blood-written messages, including the chilling phrase, "Victim 4 in 2 weeks. Catch me if you can." He looted valuables, answered the ringing phone to mock family members, and staged the scene to create terror, demonstrating not only physical cruelty but psychological manipulation. Third murder, Christopher Earl Burgess. Bryant's spree culminated with the abduction and murder of 35-year-old Christopher Burgess. Bryant lured him to a secluded location, then shot him execution-style, leaving the body in a remote area. This final killing cemented Bryant's spree as a coordinated series of terror-driven acts, targeting both acquaintances and strangers in cold, calculated fashion. Throughout the spree, Bryant also committed multiple burglaries, arson attacks and assaults, demonstrating a consistent pattern of violence, deception and psychological torment. His acts were deliberate, each more extreme than the last, instilling fear across the community and challenging law enforcement to identify the escalating threat. From the moment the first murder occurred, law enforcement sensed a disturbing pattern emerging. The brutality of Clifton Gainey's killing, combined with the subsequent grisly murder of Willard T.J. Teagan Jr., where blood-taunting messages were left on the walls, signaled a predator who was not only violent but calculated, methodical, and unafraid to challenge the community and the authorities directly. Detectives immediately realized that these crimes were linked. The same rural areas, the consistent escalation of violence, and the deliberate targeting of both acquaintances and strangers pointed to a single perpetrator operating with a mixture of rage and cunning. Investigators began assembling every piece of evidence with painstaking care. Crime scene technicians meticulously documented the arson at Gainey's trailer, cataloging charred belongings, traces of accelerant and partial fingerprints that survived the fire. At Teagan's home, they preserved the blood-written messages, the positioning of candles, the trajectory of bullet wounds, and the pattern of ransacked belongings, each element revealing Bryant's twisted psychological signature. Physical evidence such as footprints, tire tracks, and tool marks in broken doors provided additional clues that law enforcement used to reconstruct the timeline and movement of the killer. Witness accounts became critical in narrowing the suspect list. Neighbors recalled seeing a young man acting suspiciously near the crime scenes, sometimes loitering near isolated roads or asking for help under false pretenses. Multiple reports of an unfamiliar vehicle matched Bryant's car, and the pattern of sightings, all coinciding with the time of the murders and burglaries, helped establish his proximity to the crimes. Law enforcement also interviewed friends, family, and acquaintances of Bryant, seeking insight into his movements, relationships, and potential motives. Through these interviews, detectives learned of his prior criminal tendencies, temper, and erratic behavior. Small pieces that, in retrospect, fit into the larger mosaic of a man capable of escalating violence. The breakthrough came when investigators were able to recover stolen property linked to the crimes from locations associated with Bryant. Items from Gainey's burned trailer, valuables taken from Teagan's home, and personal belongings of Burgess were all found in Bryant's possession. These discoveries provided an irrefutable physical link between him and the spree of murders, burglaries, and arson. Combined with forensic evidence and corroborating witness statements, law enforcement had a mounting case pointing squarely at him. When authorities finally brought Bryant in for questioning, they confronted him with the overwhelming evidence. Eyewitness accounts, physical traces from multiple crime scenes, recovered stolen property, and the detailed pattern connecting all three murders. At first, he attempted evasive answers, but as the interrogation intensified, he began to admit details only the perpetrator could know. Bryant confessed to the killings of Clifton Gainey, Willard Teagan Jr., and Christopher Burgess, as well as to the burglaries, arson, and other assaults that formed the spree. He described the methods, the timing, and the choices of each victim with unnerving clarity, revealing a chilling awareness of his actions. Even after his arrest, Bryant's behavior remained volatile. While in custody, he assaulted detention officers, issued threats to staff, and displayed aggressive outbursts that mirrored the unpredictable and dangerous nature he had demonstrated during the spree. This confirmed for investigators and prison officials alike that Bryant was both dangerous and remorseless, a man whose crimes were not isolated acts of impulse but part of a deliberate and terrifying pattern. The culmination of meticulous forensic work, detailed witness testimony, recovered stolen property, and Bryant's own confessions left no room for doubt. He was the orchestrator of the 5-day reign of terror that had shattered lives and terrorized an entire community. Bryant's trial commenced in 2008, with him pleading guilty to the 3 murders, arson, and associated felony charges. The prosecution emphasized the calculated nature of his crimes, the extreme brutality, and the psychological torment inflicted on victims and their families. The defense argued that Bryant suffered from severe brain damage due to prenatal exposure and a lifetime of abuse, and that his mental capacity had been compromised. However, the courts found that the murders were deliberate and methodical, noting the careful planning, execution-style killings, and taunting behavior. Bryant was sentenced to death for Teagan's murder, while life sentences were imposed for the other 2 killings. Multiple appeals citing mental health and trauma were rejected, and his execution was ultimately scheduled for November 14, 2025. On the evening of November 14, 2025, Stephen Corey Bryant, now 44 years old, faced the ultimate consequence for his 5-day reign of terror at Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. Opting for the firing squad over lethal injection or the electric chair, Bryant became the third inmate in South Carolina that year to choose this method, a grim reminder of the state's rare but still utilized execution option. Before his final walk, he was granted a last meal of carefully selected items: a spicy mixed seafood stir-fry, fried fish over rice, egg rolls, stuffed shrimp, 2 candy bars, and a slice of German chocolate cake. Each bite represented his final indulgence, a stark contrast to the horrors he had inflicted on others, and a quiet, private ritual before facing death. When the time came, Bryant was escorted into the execution chamber, the air thick with tension. He was strapped into a heavy steel chair, his arms and legs secured, and a white target carefully positioned over his heart. 3 correctional officers, volunteer executioners trained for the grim duty, raised their rifles in unison. The room fell into a tense silence, punctuated only by the measured breathing of those observing behind bulletproof glass. At the command, the rifles discharged. The shots were instantaneous and fatal, ending Bryant's life within seconds. There was no struggle, no final words. He made no final statement, leaving only silence in the chamber as the weight of justice was carried out. A medical official confirmed his death at 6:05 p.m., marking the end of a life defined by violence, terror, and suffering inflicted on others. The execution closed a chapter that had haunted Sumter County and the surrounding communities for over 2 decades. While Bryant's death may have brought legal closure, the emotional scars and memories of his victims and their families remain, a chilling reminder of the darkness he had unleashed during those fateful 5 days. Case 3. Richard Barry Randolph, Florida. Richard Barry Randolph was a former employee of a convenience store in Palatka, Florida, a place he once knew well. On the morning of August 15, 1988, he walked into that same store not to work but to steal. With familiarity came betrayal. The target was the store safe, but the manager he once knew, Minnie Ruth McCullum, 62 years old, would unwittingly intersect with his plans in a way that forever changed her fate. At 27, Randolph was no shadowy stranger but someone with a connection to the store. Yet whatever desperation, rage or greed that had built inside him overcame any sense of past acquaintance or humanity. That day, what began as a robbery attempt, however misguided, would spiral into a violent crime so vicious that it would echo for decades before justice caught up. Early that morning, Randolph entered the store wearing a former employee's smock. As the hours passed, he moved toward the safe, preparing to break in. But fate intervened. McCullum returned, perhaps from a routine task, and caught him in the act. Panic, rage, or sheer cruelty took over. In the ensuing struggle, Randolph turned on McCullum with brutal force. He beat, strangled, stabbed, and raped her. The attack was savage, violent, and prolonged. McCullum fought, resisted, but the assault left her gravely injured and traumatized. Once he realized he could not obtain the contents of the safe, Randolph fled, but not before committing further betrayals of trust. He took McCullum's car as his getaway vehicle and attempted to cover his tracks. Inside the store, the scene was horrific. The counter area was in disarray, the security camera was torn down, wires dangled from a tipped-over trash can, the back room door was shut, hiding the horror he had unleashed. As he drove off in McCullum's car, 3 women who had come to the store noticed the commotion, the locked doors, the eerie silence, the disarray through the windows, and sensed danger. They called for help. Inside, deputies found McCullum lying on the floor, badly wounded, her head and neck bleeding, a knife beside her. She was in a coma when taken to a hospital. Despite desperate medical efforts, she died 6 days later due to irreversible brain injuries. Her death transformed the case. This was no longer a robbery gone wrong, it was murder, sexual battery, and a violent betrayal. As soon as deputies arrived at the store, the investigation swung into high gear. The crime scene was documented thoroughly. The smashed security camera, the tipped trash can, the disarray behind the counter, the footprints and signs of forced entry, every detail accounted for. Detectives and crime scene investigators collected physical evidence, took photographs and interviewed witnesses, including the 3 women who saw Randolph leave. Their testimony, of a man driving off in the victim's car shortly after the disturbance, became a cornerstone of the case. Investigators rapidly linked Randolph to the store. He was a known former employee. His smock, worn by someone familiar with the layout, added suspicion, and the stolen getaway car, McCullum's own, further connected him to the crime. The break came when authorities learned that the same day he fled, Randolph was spotted in Jacksonville, behaving furtively. trying to borrow money and attempting to cash lottery tickets that matched those stolen from the store. Based on the tip, police moved in, arrested him, and recovered items tied to the crime. Confronted with the physical evidence, the security camera tampering, the victim's car, the stolen tickets, and the statements of the eyewitnesses, Randolph confessed. He admitted everything: the break-in attempt, the violent struggle, the assault, theft, and the escape plan. He even directed investigators to bloody clothing he had discarded after fleeing the store. That confession, combined with forensics and eyewitness identification, solidified the case beyond reasonable doubt. In February 1989, Randolph stood trial. The court heard the gruesome details: how the crime unfolded, the violence, the betrayal, the horror inflicted on McCullum. The jury found him guilty on multiple counts: first-degree murder, armed robbery, sexual battery, and grand theft of the car. Despite some jurors considering mitigating circumstances, including his admitted addiction to crack cocaine and his troubled background, the heinous nature of the crime overrode any sympathy. The brutality of the rape, beating, stabbing, and betrayal of trust weighed heavily. With an 8-4 majority recommendation for death, the judge sentenced him to death on April 5, 1989. Over the next 3 decades, Randolph filed appeals, contested aspects of his defense, and claimed procedural issues, but every attempt failed. The courts repeatedly upheld his conviction and sentence. By 2025, after nearly 37 years, his time on death row ended. On the evening of November 20, 2025 at Florida State Prison near Stark, the state prepared to carry out the sentence long upheld by the courts. At 6 p.m. sharp, the curtain to the execution chamber was raised. 2 minutes later, the standard 3-drug cocktail was administered: sedative, paralytic, and heart-stopping injection. Witnesses observed the ritual grimly. Randolph's eyes closed, his face twitched briefly under the influence of the drugs, his breathing grew heavy and labored, and within minutes his body went still. A warden shook him, called his name. There was no response. At 6:12 p.m., a medic pronounced him dead. There were no last words, no final statements. The execution was clean, swift, final. His death marked the 17th execution carried out in Florida in 2025, setting a new record for a single year in the state's modern death penalty era. For many, it represented the end of a long, painful chapter for the victim's family and a grim milestone in a state undergoing a surge of death penalty enforcement. As we close the chapter on these 3 chilling cases from November 2025, the calculated terror of Stephen Corey Bryant, the decades-long horror of Bryan Frederick Jennings, and the shocking betrayal by Richard Barry Randolph, we are left to confront the darkest corners of the human mind and the ripple effects of their crimes. Which of these cases struck you the hardest? Which story shook you to your core or left you questioning how such acts could unfold? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your perspective. Every reaction counts. If you found this video intense and eye-opening, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the world of true crime, justice, and the stories that continue to haunt us long after the headlines fade. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. The truth is waiting, and the stories are darker than you might imagine.